welcome back to the Real Estate 401k show. Little changes today. Of course, I'm your host, Mike Weinstein. I got Ryan Gerdes down at the end. Justin had to take off because he's a loser. And we got our very dear...
again, dude.
What?
Don't ever do that ever again.
Loser. I'm going to make that your ringtone.
Oh, my God, dude. You've been watching too much Clueless.
How about have a big giant drink of shut the hell up right there? Take a big sip of that. And we got our really dear friend, Colonel Christopher Marslender, better known as Mulligan. We just had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with you and meet you when you were the squadron commander for the Angry Peckers, or the Triz at Luke Air Force Base. Peck, go peck yourself. And been one of, I mean, dude, for Ryan and I, it's been one of the, we've met a lot of cool people there. Don't get me wrong, we've met a lot of cool
people working there.
Dude, it has just been an honor and a privilege to call you friend. And
likewise, fellas, thank you.
And be able to spend time with you. And I kicked your ass on the golf course today on one hole. I got you. And
they come up every once in a while.
Every once in a while, and it feels really good. I'm not gonna lie.
Sometimes there's truth in advertising the call signs.
Yeah, I had you through the first 3 holes.
You did.
And then,
you did.
And then I fell.
Well, I think he had both of us through the first 3, and then he got back to Mike. So
yeah. I was doing pretty good the first couple
that
holes.
Par 3, you put it in tight. Yeah.
I mean, like the best astronauts, sometimes they eventually come back to Earth.
Right.
It's just the way it works.
So I do want to kind of get into a little bit about real estate, because we've obviously, outside of being friends, playing golf, drinking, and smoking cigars, I've had a lot of great conversations with you and Mary about real estate and kind of advising you and guiding you through some of the decisions that you make. But you have since left Luke Air Force Base and now work at the Pentagon. And last April, we got the honor of going out there and actually taking a tour of the Pentagon. So thank you for that. That was one of the coolest things.
No, it was a lot of fun to walk you guys around there. I mean, it's the most museum of an office building I've ever been in. There's a lot of amazing stuff.
You didn't do shit for us. Your mom gave us the greatest tour of. That's a tour that nobody will get.
Well, she's got a couple of monuments in there after what she did. So
when we got over to the medical area, where it was unbelievable, because
she had us all crying.
Because whoever was proctoring or walking us around, they basically just said, "I'm stepping back,"
and they knew they knew out of respect,
super cool of
she knew stuff.
Yeah, it was a young Air Force airman, and super cool of her to recognize that and then also vocalize it, and my mom just started talking, which was a lot of fun.
So for us as civilians, for the most part, our understanding of the Pentagon and what goes on in the Pentagon, we all who are old enough remember 9/11, and 2, our perception of the Pentagon is what we hear on the news. What really goes on in the Pentagon, and what don't we know about the Pentagon?
Yeah, so if you consider the reach and impact of the U.S. military, that building is involved in things that are going on, shaping the world 24/7, 365. I mean, the National Military Command Center is there. All the decisions that are made from a budgetary perspective. I mean, the Department of Defense is an $850 billion budget. It is the single biggest executive agency that we have. It is shaping the world every single day inside of that building. It's a little bit of a Sisyphus story from time to time, of shoving the boulder up the mountain, with how sausage actually gets made inside of that building. But there are there's 30,000 great Americans running around inside that building, doing what they think is best to try to further the existential reasons for being an American, essentially on a daily basis. So there are small decisions, big decisions. I mean, every single day getting made, running around those hallowed halls. So it is a busy experience.
What was most shocking to me? I mean, obviously I'd heard of it, but the presence of Space Force personnel that was there.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that. I mean, it was every third person that I walked by. They had a Space Force badge on, and so I mean, I'd be really interested to hear your insight on their impact of what's going on at the Pentagon and obviously in all with defense.
Yeah, I mean, space is one of the things. I mean, if you're, I'm going to use big words here for a second. You know, like I did with Peloponnesian Wars. So
talk to me, I got you.
So just buckle up. So if you kind of go back to the advent of air power as a capability, right? And Julio Duhay was one of the first air power theorists, you know, in the Italian military, and he sort of theorized like, hey, airplanes can go, because at the time the firepower or kinetic kill chain that was sort of feared was artillery. Partially because it was a little bit, you couldn't, it only had so much accuracy, and partially because of the range of it could just go up and over trenches and all these other things, because trench warfare was such a thing in World War I. And so Julio Duhay, having grown up during World War I, and kind of writing a lot of his pieces sort of during World War I and on the back end of it, theorized like, hey, aircraft are going to be so powerful, they can just go up and over everything. You could literally hold anything at risk. Right, and Julio Duhay managed to father a lot of principles of air power theory, and at the same time, you know, he joked that he sort of demonized a lot of things because somebody, as soon as he said that, if not prior, somebody thought, well, what if I could just shoot airplanes down? And so I like to joke, like, you know, or like while Wilbur was flying, Orville was sitting on the ground going, how could I knock that airplane out of the sky?
Right, it kind of made infantry, you know, way less potent.
Well, infantry still has the staying power, and that's sort of the challenge that we feel from a strategic tension as an Air Force, is that we don't have the staying power that infantry has. Like, you know, you win wars by winning hearts and minds, like ultimately. You know, and the Air Force doesn't necessarily win hearts and minds. We sort of pave the way for other people to go do that, and it's sort of how we fold into the joint force. But in terms of the Space Force, I like to think of that as a continuation of Julio Duhay's sort of mindset of like, hey, they're going to go so high and so far that nobody can touch them, and that's, you know, they have sort of impunity, you know, over the skies, and there are technologies that can get out and touch, you know, Space Force technologies. The thing that is really interesting at this point, and that I think is very, very unique at the time that Space Force is coming along in 2019 when President Trump, you know, inaugurated the branch, was the amount of privatization in that side of the military that we have not seen in previous branches. I mean, you know, the Constitution stood up the Army and the Navy. The Marine Corps came along not too terribly long after that. Mm-hmm. The Air Force was certainly the most junior branch at that point in 1947. But we've always been extremely heavy-handed in government investment and government development of government things. I mean, like if anybody has seen the movie Oppenheimer, like you sort of see how DARPA was formed on the backs of the Manhattan Project. And there's a lot of technologies today, or there are a lot of technologies today that stem from government investment in government agencies developing things for the government that then branch out and eventually go to the private sector. And the Space Force is one of those times that we're starting to see that flip, where there's actually private equity going into private in private firms and sort of venture capitalism that is now being leveraged inside government agencies, particularly the Department of Defense and the Space Force, and it's a complete inversion of that ratio.
Do you
where the dollars
do you like that?
Yeah, is it a good thing?
Well,
because we should do it with the United States Postal Service.
Yeah, I mean, being an employee of the executive branch, I'll keep my personal opinions to myself of like, you know, what particular agencies are efficient or inefficient with their taxpayer dollars. But what I will say is, the thing that I do love about private investment, and like you guys own a business, you're forced to make hard decisions, and it's just fact. And government's a little bit different in how government, you know, legally has to operate. And so there is the potential for goodness in requirements for those hard decisions to be forced. And I think we're seeing that in some ways. I mean, Space Force, quite frankly, like, let's say just very basically, you wanted to put a satellite into orbit for no reason, like for whatever reason, pick your reason. There's the first question is, what's the cost to build the satellite and how long is it going to take? The second question is, what's the launch cost, right? And then the third question I realize is, because there's always a sustainment tail, orbitology has a degradation to it. So like you can't put something in orbit and it just stays there forever. Like at some point,
everything has a life.
It degrades and it comes back down. And so those three questions are really essential to answer. And the third one's really a function of the first two, right? Of how much does it cost to build, and then what's the launch cost? And one of these things that Elon has done with SpaceX is it's driven the launch cost way down.
I heard that he pretty much launches 95% of the satellites that go up in space globally.
But it's because, and that may or may not be true, I don't know the stat, but it's because of the ability to get after driving the launch cost down. Because if you think about it, a launch cost is in your guys' terms, it is a sunk cost. Like once it's done, it's done. It doesn't matter if it works or doesn't work. And it's a one and done kind of a thing. And that's part of the beauty behind this recoverable rocket model that he's built. I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, the back in I think it was the late 80s or maybe early 90s was the last time we did this. We used to paint, when the space shuttle program was still alive, we used to paint the main fuel tank, the big giant tank that sat on the bottom of the space shuttle. We used to paint it white. So I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars we would spend painting a tank white to jettison the thing in space and have it burn up in reentry, right? But like that was the mentality of launching things into space, was like, we'll do it. It's no big deal. And I think that we've started to look at that, particularly from an economic standpoint, which drives everything, right, is the economy side of it. And understanding that is the difference between doing this a few times and doing this in perpetuity. And so I think from a Space Force perspective, whether it be the number of people walking around, which they're still trying to get their end strength up, quite frankly, and they're working on that part, but the amount of play that they have and the applicability that they have across the entire Joint Force is incredibly crucial, and it's very, very busy.
On a more important note, can you get your hands on a RMO for SpaceX for Ryan and I?
I'll do my best.
That would be badass.
That would be
dude.
badass.
I'll do my best.
All right, I hesitate here to go here. You and I have had some discussions, and so obviously you are with the United States Air Force. You are stationed. I don't know if it's called stationed, but you're in the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to ask you questions that you don't feel comfortable answering. So just slap me. But
slap him either way.
But we're not. Ryan and I,
I'm looking
we're,
at you.
Yeah.
Our podcast has never
Manchester.
never been. Jesus. It's never,
I'll slap him off camera.
Yeah, you didn't say Liverpool.
So it's never been about politics, and Ryan and I never share where we align, and so forth. But obviously, Trump is president again, and it's constantly in the news, and for us as just civilians and just our listeners, the only thing that we know about the political climate is based on whatever news channel or channels that we watch or listen to. But as far as the defense goes and the Air Force or the Pentagon, like, what are your guys' opinions? What's the talk on the town about what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, fair question. And I think the first thing to understand is that we swear an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's meaning that we will support and defend the document, not a particular office, not a particular person or group of people, that will defend the document. And that's sort of our grounding principle, right? And that's why we say that oath every time without fail at every single promotion that we take.
And that's why, to me, that's why our military are the biggest badasses in the world. It doesn't matter. We follow rules. We follow the Constitution.
They can detach themselves from the emotion.
And I got a job to do.
That's right.
And I got a mission. And it doesn't matter who's at the helm. We're going to get that mission accomplished.
We can separate the two, and we do separate the two. And that's not me personally saying any particular opinion I have about anybody that's in office now or has been in office before in my, almost 21 years in service. I mean, it's just a fact that I've sworn to, and just like I said in the last episode, that I raised my right hand and took the oath to again, when I promoted colonel last year. So what I will say is I think Garth Algar had it right when he said, we fear change. Right back in Wayne's World. That
I was just about to say that's Wayne's World.
I love the moment of pause in both your faces when I quoted Garth Algar.
Yeah,
But what I will say is, administrative changes are tough on the military. Change is hard, and that's okay. President Trump was elected very clearly in November, and the country, clearly a majority of the country, and in particular the way the Electoral College works, sent him in, with a mission to do, and the promises that he made on the campaign trail. And so we in the U.S. military know that comes with some change based on that were things that were different than what was happening in the previous administration, and that's perfectly fine. That means that given the timing of it and how our life cycle sort of happens in the Pentagon, particularly with fiscal things, that we have to abide, not only, of course, follow that change, but then we have to adjust to it based on the timing of when it shows up. And again, that's okay. The civil-military relationship that we have in the United States is one of the few things that separates us from a third world dictatorship, because the U.S. military does not at any point say, we're going to have our own opinion, we're going to go the way we want to go, and you, the civilians, are going to have to deal with it. It's the exact opposite. We say, we're going to follow the elected officials, and the elected officials are supposed to do whatever the will of the people is. And so the fact that exists, and that we are, thank you for the compliment, that we are good at it, separates us from 178 other countries around the world.
Your
in
comrades
a very,
are good
very
at
positive
it. I don't
way.
know about you, but your comrades are good at it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I think right now there's a lot going on, and it's just because many of us in the military are trying to adjust to some of the change. There are a lot of, and it's not a bad way. It's not it's not in one way or the other, good or bad. It's really just that we are trying to do what we're being told to do, and we're trying to figure out the best way to do it. So I think to ground it for us is that we're pragmatic inside of the bounds that we're given in terms of orders and direction. And so we're trying to do that in the smartest way possible, within those bounds. And that's really it. So it's busy for sure. It's not just like, another Tuesday, but it's not in any way because of any particular inject or direction or anything that we're being given. It is literally just, hey, this is, new sheriff. And so we're trying to abide by what the sheriff says, because that's what we've sworn to do based on the Constitution.
All right, so our last question is taking us all week to get here, because I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, the conversations we've had all week. But you are a real estate investor, like Ryan and I, and we have a lot of conversations about real estate, and we've taken a lot of calls from you asking about this and that and that, and
you and
so
Mary
forth.
recently closed on one of your
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
congratulations.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
With much help and suggestion from you guys and from Justin and all that. So.
And so if you don't want to answer it, great, not a big deal. But removing yourself from your position at the Pentagon and somebody who's invested in real estate and wanting to build a real estate portfolio, the climate that's going on in the political world, what are your thoughts and what are your personal feelings on that, and how that's going to impact you? Great
question. I mean, I think the rule number one, and this is just my thoughts personally, and I'm sitting surrounded literally by two experts, so I'll stand by to be corrected. But anytime you're investing in real estate, I mean, personally, I kind of think like, well, I've got to make sure that this is set up that if something goes awry, I can weather this storm, because real estate's not a short-term game, right? It's a very long-term game. And so in terms of the impacts on the political environment, I think that comes down to, okay, well, how broad of a political environment are we talking? So like, I own a house here in Phoenix. What are my expectations of what happens here to the Phoenix economy? I mean, there's a tremendous amount that's hard to keep up with from the other side of the country. And so in terms of how I think that how home value may go up or down, I don't personally worry about it. Like I have said in a previous podcast, Luke Air Force Base isn't going anywhere. It's an economic centricity to the West Valley. And I think it's going to continue to bring a lot of economic prosperity to the West Valley for the foreseeable future. But that in itself doesn't drive the housing market. And I can't necessarily affect or predict, just no better than you guys or anybody else can, of what's going to happen in the housing market here in Phoenix. So I try to drive both my tenants to a point and my costs to a point where I know that it's at least sustainable, and or I've got a parachute in the backdrop if I need it to overcome short-term things, right? I mean, like every 11 years, cyclically, the U.S. economy is supposed to have a little bit of a reset. You know, we're last I checked, we're about like 15 to 17 years post the last one, right? So like we're just sort of due. But there have been a lot of things that have been influencing the economy, particularly, you know, in 2020 with the pandemic, and then in the aftermath, you know, in 2020 and 2024 kind of region. And so I think it's a huge sort of question mark, personally, from where I sit, for the next few years. As far as DC goes, I think it's... Sorry, go ahead.
So why do you think it's been 15 years?
Well, I think outside, you know, 2020 had an effect, certainly the pandemic, and this is why I say I stand by to be corrected.
It definitely shifted the sine curve.
Right, and that's what my read on it was, and I moved here for the first time in 2010, kind of right on the trail end of the Great Recession, right? When home values here in the Valley had taken a giant hit and then started to steadily climb back out. And it seemed like for about 10-ish years, 10 to 11 years, there was like steady growth going here in Phoenix. And you guys know better than I do because you were here and this was your business. And then 2020 hit and there was a burble, and then demand rapidly outpaced supply and prices went crazy. And it seemed like we've been in a little bit of a correction off of that, but it's still been, if you look at it over the last 15 years, it's still been steady growth. But in terms of the national economy and what the economy's done, again, we had what I would call a burble in 20, but which we overcame by a tremendous amount of federal expenditure at the name of debt.
That's
which again, not to be political, but it's just science, right?
It's facts.
And I think we kept floating the economy as a result of that. And so if prior to that, and maybe our fiscal, you know, sort of policies changed in the middle of that, or maybe they've changed for a while, remains to be seen. If the cycle was every 11 years, we're well past the end of that cycle. And so I'm not at all saying to expect a recession or predict a recession. I'm just sort of curious of like, well, the last time that we kind of should have had a recession, arguably with the pandemic, we didn't. Like we had a slowdown for about 1 to 2 years, and then we sort of steady growth our way out of it, but inflation went bananas. And so it's sort of a like, well, that's not really a recession, so how does it end up? But the housing market only just climbed out of that. And so this is one of those things that we've started to divorce the notion of like, how is the U.S. economy doing? How is the willingness of the American taxpayer to spend $1 doing? Like their willingness to spend $1, and how is the home market doing? I think are starting to diverge a little bit. And I don't know exactly if I know they're still tethered together, but I think they've separated just a touch than maybe what we thought about them in like 20 or 30 years ago.
So do you think, with that being said, that political involvement could actually be more of the driving force than what a free market and the behaviors that consumers actually have?
Well, I don't think one subjugates the other, but I do think there's always room for governmental involvement to affect the will of the market. I mean, and I say that from a standpoint of market values are different in a capitalistic society than they are in a socialistic society than they are in a communistic society. I mean, those are three different widespread
models,
right? Of government intrusion into day-to-day life of you know, somebody with money in their pocket. So can a government swoop in and change capitalist value or market value?
I think we can all agree. 100%, for sure.
Yeah, the question really is, number one, I think, for how long, right? And number two, like, to what detriment of the rest of society around that particular aspect of the market. And so I'm not saying we did something right or wrong necessarily during the pandemic. Yeah. I'm just saying that I think from a timing perspective, regardless of acts of God and everything else, it would have made sense that the pandemic would have caused a full-blown recession, and it just didn't.
Yeah. I
think the economic drivers through it were very, very different than what we'd seen in the past.
Interesting.
And I think that I don't know. So the big question for me personally is like an investor, real estate owner is like, okay, so does that reset the clock? So in theory, should I be thinking about what this looks like in the early 2030s? You know, and I don't know that it does. I think a little bit. I go, okay, bets are off. I don't really know. We're just going to see how it goes, and I'm just going to go back to dollar cost averaging and sort of thinking my way through that. So that's what I say about the Phoenix side and the economic side. The DC side, because I know you're a little bit interested in that. I think from a housing market perspective in DC, I heard a stat recently that 30% of the economy is controlled outside, like inside the DC metro area. 30% of the national economy. I completely believe that, and watching what goes on there and living there, and I think that I think there's always going to be demand there. It's going to become a huge question of supply versus demand and what's the inventory look like and things like that.
I mean, and again, not to get political, but it is what it is. Doge and Trump, they're laying off a lot of DC people.
Yeah.
Like, I hadn't even thought about it till now. Like, are you anticipating that? How does that impact the DC market?
Well, I mean,
because that's a lot of jobs.
It
Whether
is.
you're for it or not, it at the end of the day, a lot of people are losing their jobs.
It is, and you know, there's a human aspect to this, right? And you can't wish that away, and that is challenging, right? Regardless of whatever is good or bad for the American taxpayer and the federal government, it is challenging to grapple with the human element side of it. What I will say is there's about 3 million people working for the federal government, I think, and that's before you really delve into sort of the reservists and National Guard side of the U.S. military. And that's a lot of folks, but they're not all in D.C. And this is one of the things that I've said. And to your point about hey, what we understand is what we see on the news. The first thing I would say to the viewers is the news networks are there to make a dollar, period.
There's two people you're talking to.
Well, hi, Christine. Hi, Mindy. So, at any rate, what I would say is the news networks are there to make a dollar, right? And so I'm not saying that they're all telling you the truth or not telling you the truth. I'm saying that they're there to make a dollar, and that's their motivating factor at the end of it. So that is something I will say has been a stark change of living in DC and hearing conversation versus living in not DC is the amount of connectedness that you feel to a lot of the things that we hear about on the national level. Like living there, you feel connected to it. I mean, in July, the day that the first assassination attempt for Trump happened, Mary and I went to dinner and we're listening to a couple next to us have a conversation about how they thought it was staged. And I'm like, this conversation is probably not going on around the dinner table in like Nebraska. Like, I'm just taking a guess. But at any rate, I think that, like I said, change is difficult. I think that we're trying to see where it goes. I don't think the indispensability of the DC metro area is completely inarguable. I mean, like it is here to stay, and a lot of the people are there to stay. And so whether it's a Doge or some other factor comes in, and there's this huge economic pullback, particularly in the housing market as people leave, I think it probably looks a little bit like a burble, kind of like the pandemic looked. You may not see the price rise like you did coming out of the pandemic, but I think it's short-lived, and it's from my perspective, having just purchased a home in the DC area last spring, I think housing there is a solid investment, provided you can make the numbers work, because the cost of living out there is pretty steep. So,
all right. Well, I'm going to have to do some research and figure out whether the hashtag burble is going to get us anywhere, much less figure out what the hell it means. So my last question for you, Ryan and I are going head to head, running for the president of the United States. Who are you stumping for? Who are you voting for?
Oof, man.
Okay, I won't make you.
You always ask questions you don't want the answer.
I know.
Can we get a combined ticket? Like one of you is president, one of you is vice? Because here's
the deal. Here's the deal.
Yeah,
what we'll do, we'll share it. He'll be president for 2 years. I'll be president for 2 years.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant share it like day on, day off, which I actually like that idea a little better.
No. Hey,
that sounds
Mulligan,
like a lot of work.
Thanks, buddy.
Dude,
appreciate you.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate you, man.
All right. If you've enjoyed this conversation, especially if you're in the military, Ryan and I specialize in helping our military veterans really, truly understand the principles in building wealth and real estate. We'd love to have that conversation with you. Go ahead and text the word. How about DC? the initials DC to 623 AZ Recon. That's DC to 623 AZ Recon.